Just let me know when you record and I'll get started.
We're all set to go, Sheila.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Sheila Mahoney, and on the line with me is Monique Garrett. We're here today to present our next webinar in our corporate strategy webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about how to conduct a user group. So user group best practices, the official title is So You Want to Have a User Group. And we're going to get started in just a second. Maybe Monique, if you could advance to our agenda.
Sure.
Okay. So in terms of the topics we're going to cover today, we're going to introduce why we're here and who we are and what went into this webinar. We're going to talk about what is a user group, because there's actually more than one definition out there. We're going to talk about the reasons why to do one or not. We're going to put this in the perspective of the technology and the company stages. So a user group looks different at the very beginning of a product or a company than it does in, as a product or a company reaches maturity. I'm going to talk about the budget, very, very important, how to actually pay for it. The logistics around a user group are very important, so what venue and other logistics issues. I'm going to cover what is it that you would typically see at a user group, what types of activities need to be there. Probably my favorite slide is our list of do's and don'ts on a user group. And then the follow-up, like how to actually follow up a user group. And then we're going to finish with a case study. Lorenz was gracious enough to allow us to use them as an example. And we're going to talk a little bit about their recent user group that took place, I believe it was 2 months ago. So some really great takeaways from that, from a recent experience. Just a reminder that as you have questions, everybody is on mute. If you could please use the chat feature to write in your questions. We're going to leave some time at the end to address Q&A. Okay, next slide. So in terms of introduction, who we are, between myself and Monique, we are each in this space 20+ years, which means I suppose we have 40 years of collective experience in life sciences R&D. So primarily regulatory, clinical operations, preclinical to some extent, and much of what we are talking about, it can be applied to other verticals as well, but our perspective is extremely focused on life sciences R&D. We came from both working at drug sponsors as well as last 15 years, at least in my case, on the vendor side. So we actually do have both perspectives. We're directing this webinar to the life sciences R&D vendor ecosystem. So the vendors that actually serve life sciences R&D is who we invited. Again, it's applicable elsewhere, but most user groups have an actual technology product. We've actually seen user groups for services vendors, like primarily that they don't actually sell software, they deliver services. We've seen user groups like that. Probably at least 80% of what we've experienced is that there's a software product that is the main topic of the user group. We do have a bias, meaning that as we go through this, our perspective is not thinking about whether or not you should have a user group. 9 times out of 10, our perspective is a user group is a good thing to have, regardless of what's going on at the company or with your product or your customer base or in your market. So we believe that it promotes mutual understanding and therefore innovation. So we are advocates of having a user group. So I just want to be upfront about our bias. And we, in addition to our collective experience, the user groups that Monique and I have actually organized and led as well as participated in. We also conducted interviews in order to research this content. So we did go out to the drug sponsor community and got our our participants' input, like what do you think a user group should be or shouldn't be. And then, as I mentioned before, we have an actual vendor that we collected case study information from, and that was Lorenz, which is a regulatory publishing vendor in this space. So our next slide is the definition of a user group. And when we first started doing them, it was very much a vendor-led effort. So the vendor hosts the user group. It's usually a physical location somewhere. It's usually annual, and it's entirely run and followed up by the vendor. So that's your kind of classic definition of a user group. However, there's also another definition that is extremely valid and important, that the users themselves or self-organize, and they're almost user activists. So the vendor's not involved. The users are actually organizing their own user group, usually in some sort of teleconference, monthly or quarterly. There's no involvement from the vendors at all. It's just the users themselves. And there are some people that you talk to that feel that a user group is more definition number 2 than it is definition number 1. So definitely some different perspectives there. We feel that the best combination, or the best approach, is actually a combination where the majority falls on the vendor to host and organize and support, especially in terms of the budget for a face-to-face meeting, but that there's also a good degree of leadership from the users themselves. So, for example, the way that might look, the majority of the content is put forth, organized, and presented by the vendor, but maybe there's one meeting or two or what have you that the users actually have, where there's no involvement from the vendor at all, where it's just the users getting together talking about the issues that are relevant to them. And then there's some sort of leadership that is put forward by the user community that can then interface with the vendor development, and it really seems to be a very nice way of approaching the issue of a user group. So we've seen all 3 of these, and there may even be more, but these are the most common examples or common definitions. So the next slide is, why do a user group or not? And again, we feel that they're, 9 times out of 10 absolutely do a user group, and the reason being, probably the number 1 reason, is that it promotes understanding. So it gives the vendor a much better opportunity to understand the customers, and things that are beyond features and functions. So, for example, if a feature, one single feature, represents 1 unit of information, and software development understands that 1 unit and creates that 1 feature to address that unit of information, the truth of the matter is there's actually 10 units of information that inform the business process or the business challenge that creates the need for that feature. So, it's very rare that software development would understand all 10 units of information the way somebody that is on the user side would understand all 10 units. But if they can get close to that, if they can get beyond that 1 unit of information, this is a great opportunity to do that. So really giving the vendor an opportunity to understand on a much deeper level what the customers are actually dealing with, what their problems actually are. Likewise, it gives the customers a much better understanding of what's going on at the vendor, like even being exposed to support staff, folks that they normally wouldn't interface with, being able to meet executive management. It puts the entire company, the entire vendor, in a different perspective, and it really promotes that mutual understanding. So by fostering that level of dialogue and relationship building, it can do nothing but lead to better innovation, faster innovation, and like the second to last bullet point is to sell more. Like, yes, absolutely, eventually that does lead to an uptick in revenue that we have found. It gives the vendor an opportunity to put out messaging. So press releases around the product roadmap or developments at the company, hosting a user group both leading up to, during, and then after is a great way to put out messaging, whether it be press releases or social media or blogs or what have you, and control the messaging that goes out to the market. So it's a great opportunity to build buzz and excitement and create demand in the market. Getting data back from the current customers, I think that relates to the first bullet point, promoting that understanding. It's a great, if there's ambiguity around a business problem, a use, a feature or something, or a bug or something like that going on, this is a great opportunity for the vendor to collect actual data. So let's say, we're debating this single important feature versus 10 features that maybe are less important. So that classic software development, do you do one feature or 10? How do you make that decision? Because you've got a finite number of development resources and hours that you can dedicate towards the next version. This is a great way to collect actual data that, rather than base your feature function decisions on perception, you can actually harvest data in a forum such as this. So we polled 30 customers, and 19 of them said that they wanted that one single important feature. 6 of them wanted the 10 features, and we just didn't get the other 5, or whatever the case may be. So it's a great way to get that data. And then finally, if none of those reasons are enough, if your competitors are doing user groups and you're the only vendor who's not, that alone is a good reason to think about doing it. Before we go into or not, why not do a user group, I just want to spend a couple of slides on putting the user group in the perspective of the technology adoption lifecycle. So next slide. Hopefully everybody has seen this. The credit goes to Jeffrey Moore, who wrote Crossing the Chasm, I think in 94, 95, something around there. And essentially what this does is describe buying behaviors and activities around the technology lifecycle. So in the beginning, you're not really you don't have a great track record, but the customers who want to talk to you are innovators. They know that there's no they have a high risk tolerance, and this technology adoption lifecycle really helps vendors understand when they embark on a technology product, what's going to happen in the marketplace. So hopefully many of you have seen this already. The next slide talks about it in the context of a user group. So if you go to the next slide. Okay. So what this does, it's the same bell curve and the same, categorizing early adopters, early majority, so on and so forth. But it takes a look at what are the versions at what time frame of the bell curve. And the essential thing that this slide is trying to say, this is actually a deceptively complex slide, but when you put it in the context of the user group, there's a much different feeling at the beginning of a product than there is at the tail end of a product. And maybe that product lifespan is over the course of 5 to 10 years. In the beginning, you have user groups. There's a lot to discover about the business product, the business problem. There's a lot of development going on. There's a lot of back and forth. Maybe it's buggy. It tends to be a very vibrant, open discussion and very exciting. And that can go on for a number of years. But what happens is, and I think every vendor has this issue, the investment in the beginning is very high, but it tapers as the product reaches maturity. And then the management team settles into a year or 2 or maybe 4 to 5, 6 years of nice steady profit without really having to invest a lot. And what happens there's a very fine line. There's a ton and very legitimate incentive to reduce your investment as soon as possible, and maybe that's really when you reach early majority and late majority and you approach laggards, which is approaching, really the sunset of the product itself. There's a very hard judgment call, like, is this another year that we can collect profit without having to reinvest or redo the system or what have you? And so the way that translates to the user group is that if the management team has extended that maybe a couple of years past where they should have, Maybe it's been 2 or 3 years, that they've been collecting profit as opposed to reinvesting. The user community could be pretty discontent at that point. And so only you can decide whether or not you're at that point or not, like where when you bring the users together, it's been several years of discontent and you start losing customers as a result. I mean, we have seen this happen. It's thankfully fairly rare, but it does happen. This is probably the only reason why we would say not to do a user group. Like if you're approaching sunset and just nobody wants to admit it, then perhaps that's a reason not to do a user group. Then what you're going to do is bring everybody together. There's going to be a lot of complaining, and ultimately there's no money to fix any of these problems. Hopefully you're not at that stage, and I would say 9 out of 10 vendors in this space are not at that stage. But if you are, then that is potentially a reason not to do a user group. So just wanted to put that in perspective. Next slide. So putting that particular scenario aside, we have seen, even with healthy reinvestment, when vendors and products are on the upswing, we have seen some objection to doing a user group that we just wanted to explore. One of them is that there's nothing to say, where the vendor feels that there's nothing to say. I've heard this on more than one occasion, and when I've drilled in with the vendor as to why that's the case, it's usually because there's just not enough bandwidth to put together the content for the user group enough. Like they're working so hard. It's not that there's really nothing to say, it's just that they can't put it all together in the time that they need to because of what else is going on in the business. There's another issue that maybe there's a feature that the vendor hasn't created, and this has gone on more than a year or two, and it's going to be the second or third user group that the vendor is going to go back to the user community, and maybe they've got activists there, and say, no, we haven't done it yet. So that could be a protest. And then the other one is that the vendor doesn't want to open up the can of worms. Maybe has never had a user group, but it just seems to be too scary to put people together like that. They don't want to expose, the vendor doesn't want to expose the roadmap. They don't want to feel like they have to make commitments that maybe they're not going to live up to. Like it just is one giant conflict avoidance mechanism that perhaps is unnecessary. Monique, anything you want to add here? I realize that I've just been talking nonstop. If not, we can advance to the next slide.
No, we'll go ahead to the next slide, but I can just say that some of that in terms of not wanting to, share the roadmap or commit to the roadmap, I think is a very common theme, particularly among high-growth organizations where everyone has 4 jobs. It's really hard to make that commitment, but it's one that's really essential. It's essential from a business development perspective, but also from the perspective of engaging your customer base.
Yeah, and what we would say to this slide and these issues is that these aren't really rational reasons not to have a user group. It's really more about discomfort. So for example, if there is a feature that you haven't done for 2 years and you're going to meet with kind of a discontent user community at the user group, and maybe that's a reason not to have one. Well, it's better if there's a legitimate reason why it hasn't been done. What is ideal is to come together and explain what that reason was, allow that transparency. So really taking that leap of faith that, if we can be transparent about this, and this is a trusted group of users, they're already invested, maybe you're not delivering the good news you want to deliver, but if you can deliver an explanation and really get buy-in as to the decisions that you're making around the money that you have for software development, I mean, maybe you don't have to go into dollars and cents details, but just inviting the users to understand the decision-making is of value, even if they don't get what they want in terms of the actual features. If they understand where you're coming from, that is extremely relationship building. And the other point that I want to make here to the don't open up that can of worms, that reluctance, giving the clients a forum to vent again, even if you can't tell them what they want to hear and you can't give them everything that they want, just allowing them to vent is extremely valuable and relationship building and trust building as well. So that's what we would say to these issues. Next slide. So here's an interesting slide. Who pays for it? And another question is probably going to be that we haven't gotten it on the chat yet that I can see, but how much does it normally cost? So we're going to address some of this in generally and put as much detail in as we can. Usually it seems to come out of the marketing budget. Almost every vendor that I've worked with or attended with a user group has come out of marketing. We actually feel that ideally the budget should be a mix of marketing and product development, and the reason being is that on the surface maybe it's a marketing effort, it's relationship, it's demand creation, but the truth of the matter is, especially with respect to technology vendors, which 9 times out of 10 the user groups are based around the technology, product development is a huge beneficiary of a user group because of the data that they're collecting, and the deliverable of any user group, the keynote, if you will, is the product roadmap. And so it's really majority the content is around product development, which is owned by software development or the head of software or whoever. So it does make sense, and there is an argument to be made that part of the budget should be picked up by product development. That is pretty rare from what I've seen, and Monique, I don't know if you want to jump in there, but we feel that that is the most logical approach, and also makes for a better understanding later on, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. So some things to think about, we've had the question, like, how about registration fees? In our experience, yes, we've actually seen user groups that don't charge a fee for attendance at all. Most of them do. The ones that don't, it's usually in the beginning of hosting a user group, and as time goes on, they realize we really need to add a registration fee. So, we're definitely proponents of, starting off right off the block with a registration fee. However, regardless of what the registration fee actually is, most of the time it's discounted. So for preferred clients, or maybe you've got a handful of prospects that you're inviting, and perhaps they say it'll be a lot easier to attend this if you can waive the fee or discount the fee. Well, that happens a lot. There's a good amount that pay the full registration fee and a good amount that end up with heavy discounts or even invited for free. The long story short is that registration fees don't cover even half of the budget. It's usually around 20 or 30% of the budget that, from what we've seen, that registration fees actually cover. Having sponsors there, and by sponsors we mean if you have a partner network, if you have a platform and you've got partners that operate off of your platform to, almost like a mini ecosystem around your platform, you can invite them to exhibit and charge them a fee and give them a way to promote their product or service or whatever add-on that might be. So that definitely helps offset the budget, but again, doesn't cover the budget. There's always an investment in the user group itself. But it's not a moneymaker, meaning that the user group doesn't actually, I don't think I've ever seen a vendor profit on a user group the way conference organizations profit on conferences. It's always an investment in product development and customer retention. One other thing that I put here to consider about the budget that we normally don't see is any calculation of what the opportunity cost is. So it's pretty easy to put together the cost of the venue, cost of travel, things like that. But something to keep in mind, it is extremely costly from a time standpoint to put together the content, and it's usually your most valuable resources putting together the content. So to think about that there, it's more than just what the hotel costs or what the conference center costs. It's the opportunity cost of these extremely valuable resources spending a good deal of their time in the 3 months leading up to a user group, if not more, putting together content and managing that. So that's another thing. We're actually happy that opportunity cost usually doesn't get calculated into the budgets that we've seen, because if that was the case, there'd probably be a lot fewer user groups out there. The good news there is that it's always considered a worthwhile effort. So even though it is extremely painful and costly to utilize so much of those key resource time and attention, it's always a worthwhile endeavor. Monique, anything to add here? If not, we can move on.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and move on.
Okay. So a couple of things about logistics. This is actually a very important issue. As with everything else, it's very nuanced. There are things to consider. It really boils down to how elaborate of a venue are you going to have. Like the classic user group, could be extravagant, fancy hotels. In life sciences R&D, and especially when we polled some of the customers, the users themselves from the drug sponsor community that we spoke to, the feeling is that the big party atmosphere is not ideal. That is, as a matter of fact, we had an experience where there was a user group, I think it took place in Orlando, and there was nobody there on day 2 because the venue was so good from an entertainment standpoint that it ended up cannibalizing the content of the user group itself, which, sure, the customers walked away very, very happy and probably with great stories to tell, but in that particular case, the vendor most likely didn't hit all of the objectives that they were hoping to because they lost all their attendees on day 2. So it is really important to think about a venue that is nice, that's in alignment with where you're at as a company, that's in alignment with what your customers expect. They certainly expect better than a Best Western. Not to say that there's anything wrong with that brand of hotels, but maybe you need to have it at the Bellagio in Vegas, but something in between where it's somewhat nice, it's accessible, it's relatively easy to get to, and it allows for a lot of actual business level discussion. There's also a correlation with the size of the vendor. So if you're the Microsofts and Salesforces and Oracles of the year, yes, that's most likely going to take place at the Bellagio in Vegas and, really sell out half the city in hotel occupancy. In our space, we find that the more the customer spends, and it's usually in the $1 million to $2 million a year versus over $10 million a year threshold. $1 million to $2 million is, are nice, like very serviceable, maybe nice location, but not so distracting from an entertainment standpoint. Over 10 million, it seems to go into the more lavish, like name generating or buzz generating, where they're going to have a rock star perform or something along those lines. So those are two different animals when it comes to user groups. I would say in our space with the vendors, most of the vendors in the life sciences R&D ecosystem, it's in the serviceable, like the good venues, not the lavish venues. And those aren't, not only are the lavish venues not necessary, they're almost frowned upon by the attendees themselves. So a couple of examples. I think I already talked about lavish. There are some good but somewhat boring locations like DC and Philly and Paris and even London. There are tons of industry there already. They're very accessible. They're very typical of this space, but maybe they're not very exciting. So that's a good place to have it. But maybe if you want the venue to play a part in attracting attendees, you can pick something like that that's, again, very accessible to the customer base, not very difficult to get to, and maybe off the beaten track a little bit relative to the places we typically get to travel in life sciences R&D. So I put a couple down here, like New Orleans, for example, and Barcelona generally don't have industry conferences, but they're great cities, but also not so distracting that you're going to lose everybody on day two. One of the best user groups that I attended took place in Manhattan, so that was very expensive, as you can imagine. But in life sciences R&D, almost nothing ever takes place in Manhattan. So we got a ton of attendees simply because there was an excuse to spend time in Manhattan that most drug sponsors don't, unless you work at Pfizer, don't normally get, or Medidata don't normally get. More about logistics. When you're starting out with a user group, the attendance is usually pretty small. So I've seen a user group start with around 10 or 20 users as the first inaugural user group. And Monique, I think the example you were saying the other day that aligned pretty well with that, like a vendor that you worked with that just started out that was 20, was it 20 users?
Yes, absolutely. And I feel that it's really important to remember that it is okay to start small, because if you go back to what you were saying earlier, Sheila, about just engaging your customers and getting the conversations going, they're going to have those conversations with or without you. So even if you're small, even if it's an afternoon get together and with a sort of loosely tied together agenda, that still gives you the chance to not only hear what they're talking about, but going back to building those relationships. So starting small is okay, and it doesn't have to be, the Vegas or Pebble Beach scenario. It can be something a little more intimate and small because you're starting small. That can often be a really valuable discussion, because less people means more time for them to articulate what their topics of interest are, what their priorities are, and to dig deeper into, surface level concepts. So, so just reiterating that it's okay to start out small.
Yep, completely agree. And we see that 40 or 50 is a good number of attendees. Again, depending on the size of the product, of the user community, and of the spend, the customer spend, that's definitely proportional to the number of attendees. So if you have a product that has 2,000 users, I mean, logically, you're going to get more attendees than a product that has 15 to 20 users. And again, maybe the first product that that drug sponsor is spending $2 million a year. Maybe that other product they're only spending $500,000 a year. So those types of factors definitely affect attendees. But 50 drug sponsors in the seats, that's a good number. If you can push that closer to 100, that's great. When you're in the 200 mark, that's really, really good. But again, if you're like the Oracles of the world, you're going to have a heck of a lot more users than 200. Duration, ideal is 2 full days. You can stretch it to 2.5. We've seen user groups that are actually a half a day. Again, a lot has to do with where you're at in terms of hosting user groups, your technology adoption lifecycle, but the typical is usually around 2 to 2.5 days. Next slide. Are we waiting for the next slide?
Yeah, sorry, Sheila, it's kind of...
there it is. That's okay. Typical user group activities, the keynote, again, so much of it has to do with the roadmap. If there's one single question the users want answered, it's what's the roadmap, what's coming down the line, what do we need to plan for, what are you thinking, so on and so forth. So that is, by and large, the #1 output of the user group. You can have actual hands-on demonstrations, training sessions, classes. The #2 output, we would say, is actual client case studies. So hearing success stories, not general success stories with specific examples, and maybe calling out some of the challenges. Like, we don't want case studies that are simply cheerleaders, like this is the best product ever. Like, a good case study has a balance of the good as well as the not so good. Like, maybe all right, everybody knows we have this big bug. Here's how we dealt with it. Yes, it's on the roadmap to be fixed in 2 releases from now. In the meantime, this is the workaround. And a client actually going through what that workaround actually is incredibly valuable. So other activities are to foster dialogue between parties that normally wouldn't meet each other. So at the lunch table or at dinner, maybe you could arrange seating where executive management is sitting with a group of users. Like I've actually seen it where every table has a certain number of users and then a certain number and a mix of people from the vendor itself, like one software developer, one salesperson, one marketing person, one executive. Well, actually, that's 4 people at a table. That's usually too many. Like usually 2 people from the vendor itself to 6 people from the user community. So fostering that level of dialogue is incredibly valuable. Best practices, I think I mentioned, demo, and then obviously, dinner and entertainment, whatever the entertainment may be, whether it be a band. I've actually seen an Elvis impersonator comedian. There's a variety. So now we're on to the really interesting slide of do's and don'ts. There's various on here that we're going to emphasize. This is, again, my favorite slide. One of the most important do's is to focus on the business problem itself. There is a tendency, and we've heard this from the drug sponsors that we've spoken to, and these are people that have attended many, many user groups over the last 10 or 15 years. You could get lost in the ivory tower. Like this is the ivory tower, which I describe as the walls that surround the vendor, that the vendor starts thinking very insularly. In order to get the product done, you kind of have to. But really, the users aren't there at your user group to really learn about your product and talk about the product, and it's the product, the product, the product. Their ultimate goal is to solve their problem by using the product. So it's a distinction or a nuance, but to constantly remember, like, yeah, we're talking about the product, but the ultimate objective is the customer's problem. It's not really the product. So that, from a vendor standpoint, that is definitely a nuance to think about that comes out in very subtle ways. And it's a good reminder for everybody involved to remember that, yeah, what we sell is our product, but that's not what this user group is really all about. The product is just a means to the end being the customer's problem is solved. And that adds a much different perspective to the entire agenda. Do invite prospects, but not that many. So meaning that maybe you have people that are leads that are thinking about buying your product. You definitely don't want to have 50% of your attendees being sales prospects. We find that 15% or less is a good number, not to go above 15%. In fact, 15% is probably pushing it. And the don't that corresponds with that is to not heavily weight vendor attendance with salespeople. So a very common complaint is users being bombarded by salespeople. The salespeople come and they act like glue to the user, and the user can't escape. We've heard this on more than one occasion. We've also heard vendors that have made that an explicit objective of the user group, where they say, all right, salespeople, you stick yourself to that person's hip and don't leave. That's crazy. Nobody appreciates that walking away. On the surface, it seems like it's a good idea, but it's really not, because it puts a bad taste in the customer's mouth. And, selling should not be the ultimate objective of the user group. I mean, it's a soft sell. The user group itself is a soft sell. So why put hard sell type activities into the agenda, like throwing 1,000 salespeople at the customer base? Be sure, so going back to the do column, be careful when you're scheduling it to make sure that there's no other conferences going on and no other user groups going on. That is very difficult to do. Nobody wants to have a user group in the summer, but you look at September, October, November, and there's usually in any given month a potentially serious conflict that you have to plan for. Let's see, just going through this list, ID goals for each attendee and track against those goals. So no, you don't want to do a hard sell, but you should absolutely, everybody should understand everything going on at the account for each attendee and be ready to engage in a dialogue. So maybe the salesperson knows exactly what's going on at that account, but maybe that user is sitting at lunch with a software developer. Well, it's very good if that software developer has some context, and that can just jumpstart the discussion. So, you know, and also to track against those goals, like on this customer, we want to make them feel better about such and such, or we want to collect data about such and such. Well, afterwards, during the debrief session, did you obtain that goal? And hopefully the answer is yes. Let's see, Monique, you want to jump in, or should I just keep going?
Yeah, actually, just on that point of having that very unique opportunity of having someone like a software developer interacting with a customer, it's important not to make any assumptions about those traditionally internal people and what they know about your company messaging and positioning. So as you're planning the user group meeting, it's really important to get them sort of bought into and comfortable with any messaging that you're developing, any positioning that is probably standard for a typical salesperson or marketing person to understand and be able to, you know, articulate. Those folks can't always do that, may not be comfortable with it, so you just want to make sure to take some time to check in with them and make sure you understand where they are on that continuum and that you can help them to be comfortable and have a meaningful conversation with the customers without, you know, stepping outside of or getting themselves into trouble in a way that would conflict with the sort of broader message that you're sending out throughout your user group activities.
Yep, completely agree. And I'm just being mindful of the time. We have one more slide. That's the case study, and then we're going to go into the Q&A. So I'm just going to cherry pick the rest of these, pull out some of the more important ones. Don't expect an immediate revenue increase. So I have seen, again, depending on where the company is at in their evolution, in order to spend money, there are people internally, usually the CFO actually, that kind of demands justification, like, okay, how is this going to affect money? So there's almost, or revenue, I should say, there's almost like a built-in incentive to tie a user group, the investment in the user group, to sales. And unfortunately, if that is an explicit goal, that can change the nature of the user group itself. So it's really important to be very clear that the objective here is not new sales. The objective is customer retention and software development, so that that expenditure can be categorized correctly internally, so that you're not setting up this unfortunate artificial pressure to go make money, and next thing you know, you've got a 2-to-1 ratio of salespeople to customers because of thinking like that. Another one is follow-up, which is, the don't is don't collapse in exhaustion afterwards. Do follow up. A lot of stuff comes up in the course of a user group. Hopefully, there's a big laundry list of to-dos, and the user community wants to see those to-dos followed up. And because of the amount of effort that goes into putting a user group on, it is very difficult to circle back to that to-do list and to start operating on that, because everybody is collapsed in exhaustion, you know, at the vendor afterwards. Nobody wants to hear about the user group in month 1 or month 2 after the user group. It's just, you know, like everybody kind of cringes when they hear about it. But the thing is you absolutely have to follow up. It is the easiest thing to forget to do. And then in the 3 months leading up to next year's user group, that's the scramble of the follow-up. Just plan for it and allow a continuum of follow-up. So where that would practically follow is a debrief meeting after the user group, an internal debrief meeting, and then monthly user group internal follow-up teleconferences with mandatory attendance every month afterwards. So you can make it 30 minutes, you can make it an hour, so long as it's on your calendar and it's getting done. And the last thing I want to say, excuse me, is, there's actually a lot of really important points here, but, transparency is good. Tailor your tracks to your roles. So this came from the customer base itself. Maybe sometimes things are too broad. Maybe there's a session that's more geared towards IT. You don't want an IT session that's populated by a mix of IT and users that are technophobes. You want to tailor that to the right roles. So maybe put a little bit more thought into that, because we heard that as consistent feedback, like we wish the vendors would do that a little bit more. And the last thing I want to say here is don't promise you can do everything. You can't. Like, expect a good deal of venting, maybe 30% venting, where you just have to listen, and that can be very uncomfortable. Like, you work so hard on this product. Of course you want nothing but positive feedback, but it's really tough to just grin and bear the potential negative. But any group of users, you just have to be prepared for that, and it makes them feel better to do that. So to just be prepared ahead of time, allow it, expect the discomfort, and then let it pass, and understand that by giving them that forum to vent, you went a very long way to developing trust and strengthening the relationship. So with that, let's get into the next slide, which we're just going to talk about Lorenz very quickly and then go into the Q&A. Lorenz just had a user group, and the reason why Monique and I invited them to provide us with some content is because we heard that they actually got to the point where they were turning people away, that it was so popular that they didn't have enough room for all the users that wanted to go. That's very unusual. Usually it's the other way. The vendor is scrambling to put more bodies in the seats. So right there, that got our attention, and we reached out to the management team, and they were gracious enough to help us understand, a little bit about what they went about where you're at and what were some of the pros and cons. And essentially, they spoke very much to how difficult it is, or how the bandwidth, like how the number one challenge was the amount of time it took to put everything together. The fact that, estimating the size is always a big challenge, and in retrospect, they're very happy the way it's out, but in retrospect, they wish they had gotten a bigger venue. And my response to that was like, that is a very good problem to have, and they understand that. In their particular case, they have a very long track record of running very successful user groups in Europe for the last, I think it's at least 5 or 10 years, and this was their first one in North America. And again, very successful. The biggest takeaways, focus on the roadmap and the case studies, so they ratified that is absolutely what the clients want to hear, is the roadmap and the case studies. In terms of the challenges, I think I mentioned the time spent in developing content was enormous, the size, and then there was a lot of minutia, like things like meals, and again, you're using extremely valuable resources to put this together, put together the content and orchestrate it. And these, even if you have admin support, the amount of minutia that comes up in putting something like this together is enormous, and that's probably the thing that continuously fell off their radar, and they were constantly unpleasantly surprised with this detail or that detail, where they just wanted to focus on the content and deliver a great experience for their users. I think it's just speaking to what an investment of time and energy putting together a user group really is. And they said that, part of what they feel, and what I've actually heard, and Monique, I think you have as well, that made this effort so successful is their total commitment to customer satisfaction. So that is actually what their goal was, not so much to go and sell X numbers of licenses or anything like that, but to increase customer satisfaction. And that certainly seems to have resonated in the user base. So it was great to hear such a successful example of a really great user group, and we're very grateful to have included this content. Monique, anything else to add? Because I think we did get a couple of questions, and we've got about 8 minutes to answer them.
Sure. Yeah, just real quickly, I know So Lorenz folks, when we were talking to them, we talked about the idea of outsourcing and using an event coordinator to help you with your user group. And I think that that's a really difficult thing to do. And if you're looking at outsourcing it to an event group or an event management type team, what you want to do is make sure you do a smaller event with them in advance so that you can understand what their capabilities are, understand, it's just like working with any other team, understand the scope of their work, what they're great at, what they may not be so great at, so that you can plan accordingly. And that ties back to that whole idea of the minutia, because there's so many details that are very important. And if you have a good event manager, whether it's internal or external, those things tend to melt away. If you don't have a good event manager, they become the biggest challenges in the entire process. So just something to think about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks. I had forgotten about that. So I think the lessons learned there is don't let the user group be your first experience with an event manager. Have a couple of experiences under the belt with, and if you're going to have an outsourced partner, before you jump in with the user group. Really good point. So I have 3 questions. Monique, I don't know if you've had more, but the questions, I'm just going to read them off, and we're going to do our best to hit the answers in the next 6 minutes. How do you track and report on ROI? Great question. What's a good number of attendees to shoot for? I think we actually answered that, 20 to 50 to 100 to 200. What happens when you skip a year or stop doing them all together for whatever reason? So I think we can answer that as well. Monique, did you get any others?
I did. It's how many users do you need to have using your software before you feel a user group is relevant? And is $2 million per year the minimum investment for a user group meeting?
Okay, I'm going to address that last question first because that's a big number. I think $2 million, when we used that number before, is the amount of money that up to $2 million a year that the users spend with your software. So it could be $100,000 a year, it could be $500,000 a year. That is usually the trigger of when a user decides to participate or decides to actually go. It usually has something to do with the amount of money that's spent. When a user is spending like 10 million or more, that's when the expectation of these lavish locations, you know, so there is a spend perspective there. In terms of the money that the vendor has to spend on the user group itself, again, if we're talking about like that good, not lavish, but good, interesting location, usually around what we've seen, and you know, not drawing. This is certain experiences that I've directly had over the last 15 years. It usually ends up being around $100,000. 30% of that could be covered by registration fees. I've seen it be conducted for as little as $40,000. That was, you know, at a hotel near where the corporate headquarters was. So that's usually the investment. It does not cost $2 million a year to host a user group meeting at all whatsoever. I think, again, between 40 and 100,000, you can put together a very good user group, and that corresponds with 40, like maybe 50 to 100 actual users attending. Monique, anything to add to that? Otherwise, I'll hit the ROI question.
No, we can go ahead to ROI.
Okay. So with the ROI, that's a really, really good question. Again, it boils down to what's the objective. What was the objective that the vendor set out with? Sometimes you can't avoid the sales objective, like the management team. The CFO wants that too much, so you have no choice but to track ROI based on sales. What we've seen when it's customer satisfaction driven, when that is explicitly what the goal is, that can be justified by ROI. That could be justified by conducting surveys, like before and after, having a very good survey. You know, did you get what you wanted? How does this affect your understanding of us as a vendor? So actually having a survey at the end, you can actually show client data in terms of customer satisfaction. If you have to tie it to revenue, you can definitely, there are most likely additional opportunities with any given user. You can track that as those opportunities develop. So maybe it wasn't the user group that closed that deal for you, but maybe attending the user group influenced that customer's positive decision 3 to 6 months later, and you can certainly track that in your CRM. So between those two, customer survey and having some level of data in your CRM about ongoing or new opportunities that happened that the user group either contributed to or created. I think more than 9 times out of 10, the user group contributed to 3 to 6 months later, or even 12 months later, actual sales upticks. So I think that answers that question. What happens when you skip a year or stop doing them altogether for whatever reason? That's important. Once you start this, you should give some thought to what happens later. You know, are you going to do this every year? Transparency is the #1 answer there, is announcing one or another what you're doing and why. So transitioning, what you could do instead of a big annual meeting is transition to local road shows, like maybe do a lunch and learn, regional lunches and learn, as opposed to a meeting in North America or a meeting in Europe. But so long as you announce it ahead of time, what you don't want is your customers simply drawing their own conclusions as to what you're doing and why. Last question, I think, could you repeat the one about the users, or take that question, Monique, and then we'll wrap up. How many users, I think?
Sure, I think it was how many users. And again, to my thinking, the number isn't as important as the quality. Like I actually have a client who started out with monthly calls with some of their customer base, where they just give updates to a very small group of people. Those calls became web meetings. Those web meetings translated into their first user group. So it's sort of an evolution. And if you even have 3 customers, again, if you are facilitating that conversation, more times than not, they're actually going to be grateful for the opportunity to talk to other people using your product, talk about how they're using it, learn from them. Nobody wants to reinvent the wheel, so if somebody's come up with a better way to use it, they'll be all over that. So I honestly do think you could do it with as little as 3 to 5 people in the room and have a really great, meaningful conversation.
Great. Okay, well, with that, I think that is all the time that we have. Please, if you have any additional questions, both Monique and I are available and at your disposal at any point to follow up on any of this. We do believe that this is a great way of increasing innovation in the space, which benefits everyone, really. So we're advocates and happy to help in any way we can. And thank you so much for attending. Have a fabulous day.